Welcome to another episode of From Startup to Wunderbrand with Nicholas Kuhner. Well, howdy everyone. Now this is going to be a slight difference to our other podcast because, as you can see, there are three people on this call. Normally I just have a nice intimate conversation with two folks, but we've packed in the folks from Brink Agency, and they'll take us through exactly what they do. But this might be a very interesting discussion. We've got Joshua Belhumeur and Malcolm Critcher. Well, you guys are the partners at Brink Media, so perhaps it's worthwhile talking us through exactly what you do. And I would urge people to go to your website, because that's a pretty cool website. That must have taken a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a bit of cash, because that's not a free website. That's not a Wix website. So yeah, welcome guys.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the compliment. And it's funny, we're launching a new website at the end of this week. So always changing our website, but that's what happens when you have those skills in-house. We have designers and technologists and all of that in-house. But yeah, ultimately what Brink Media is trying to do on like the highest level is compete in the attention economy in a lot of different ways. Most notably, we have the creative agency that sits at the center of that. And, you know, with our agency, we do marketing, we do advocacy, we do politics. We're just the whole gamut of communications. I think selling ideas is more exciting to us than selling products, but we sell products with ideas as well. But then beyond that, we do film distribution, and then we do a lot of original productions, such as everything from feature films to web series to podcasts, including we just launched This Is Propaganda this year, which is how we came to know you. You saw our work there.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely recommend that, and I'm going to stick the link in the description for that series, because it's one of the best produced, most interesting series on a subject that I really love, and I think a subject that more people need to get themselves acquainted with. You need to know not just GMO foods you're being fed, but what's being fed into your eyeballs and into your ears. Malcolm, give us a little bit of your spiel on Brink.
Sure. So I got brought on to Brink, I guess about 5 years ago. I had been running a production company in Los Angeles, really focused on music videos, short films, more on the art side of the balancing act of, art, propaganda, and design. And I, ended up meeting Josh and really immediately having a really strong connection to the philosophy at Brink and the team and the culture. And it's been about 5 years that I've been there. Now I serve as the creative director at the agency. And really early on for me, my tenure at Brink was sort of this cognitive retooling of shifting from, okay, my entire view of what I'm expressing is about, I guess, the internal expression of artists or helping to enable them to express themselves, to pulling cultural levers to shift behaviors and beliefs. It's a really different, some art does that, but not all of it. Some art just wants to, make you cry or laugh or smile. And in doing that, I became deeply, deeply obsessed with this idea of, to be a well-rounded intellectual, you think a lot about economics, you think a lot about government, you think a lot about philosophy. I think marketing and advertising kind of gets put in this like kiddie play corner. We don't really treat it on the same stature. And a big part of that for me came from this initial bifurcation of propaganda and advertising that kind of stands as a manufacturing of consent for like safe and unsafe manipulation, right? Propaganda is the bad stuff. Marketing is the stuff that's okay. It's just interrupting you while you watch MTV. You don't need to be worried about that one. And I think as Josh and I started pulling at those threads, that's where a lot of This Is Propaganda almost naturally came out of us, starting to just through conversations where he is a strategist and someone deeply from the world of marketing and strategy was bringing me along. And in those conversations and in me questioning things, almost like the thesis of this podcast got pulled out of that kind of, I always love the opportunities where you get to go to grad school at a job. And this felt like I was able to go get a master's or a PhD in communications or marketing just through intense, rigorous intellectualism around these topics. And yeah, I'd say for me, what we do is pull cultural levers. It's at the highest possible level. It's identifying the the emperor has no clothes moments in culture where everyone knows something's primed for change. A belief or a behavior is ready to snap. One I was thinking about this morning, very random example, is just that everyone is on dating apps, but also everyone fucking hates dating apps. Like, that's something that's just not really being like addressed or moved, really. And finding those and then figuring out, okay, well, if what we do is tell stories, what are the levers that can quickly cause those moments that are ready for profound cultural change to quickly shift and occur? That's at the highest possible level how I think about what we do.
When I think about Brink, and when I have a look at some of the content that you're producing and the type of work that you're doing, the culture in the organization must be quite important, because this is not something that is going to necessarily attract necessarily big names, or it's not necessarily palatable right now, some of the things that you're doing for the mass market, but it is, you're slowly sort of planting the seed or putting out communications and propaganda of your own to try and shift perceptions, or not propaganda. Oh, you're going to use the propaganda term.
It's safe.
Sort of
safe space to use it for.
Peeling layers of the onion off of society that maybe are unnecessary. So we're taking the plastic packaging off and trying to go back to sort of the raw fundamentals, or just stripping back what our culture is so that we can put additional layers, layers of thinking on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's something interesting. The thing I would talk about first there is, I guess, creatives, right? And I actually think it's kind of interesting because how Josh and I, as people who are significantly under-resourced and run an agency on the smaller side, were able to make a Webby Award-winning podcast that punches way above its weight class, is because we're able to consistently attract and retain really, 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 really talented creatives, despite like the maybe the accounts we have or the work we're doing not being like Nike, right, or Adidas, the hot Apple, the stuff that when I was a professional director I was chasing. I think a really big part of that kind of falls back on that same thing of why advertising's in the kitty corner. So much of advertising is comprised of artists who could not make a full-time living being artists and have to shift over to being commissioned by corporations. And when you talk with those people and you go, look, yeah, you can go do the Cheetos Super Bowl. Sure. Like you can shoot that commercial. You're just selling Cheetos. Or you can fundamentally de-wedge a wedge issue in the American democratic mind. What sounds more interesting? They honestly, very consistently actually think that sounds more interesting and more rewarding because they're already tabling pure artistic expression. That's already something that they're putting to the side. And it's like, okay, well, if you're putting that to the side, do you want to sell more chips, or do you want to change the way that people think? Often the answer is change the way people think. And that's something I'm really, really proud of and excited about the culture we've built, is that I have people that I think normally wouldn't be actively reaching out and saying, hey, I love what you're doing. This is really exciting to me. Let me know when I can get involved. That normally I think it would be a lot harder to access.
Joshua, Malcolm touched on some important issues there when it comes to the business side. Number one, doing a Doritos or Cheetos ad is going to generate cash money for your agency, whereas world-changing ideas, that's something for UNESCO, for the UN and NGOs. Are you a money-generating business, or are you a charitable organization who does this for the joy of changing ideas?
We're definitely somewhere in between, in the sense that we don't make as much money as we could, but we're definitely trying to make money. And I think one way that we think about it, one time I drew like a graph for everybody with 4 quadrants. Left end was like no money, right end was lots of money, top was game-changing, impactful, change the world work, and bottom was like grocery store flyers. And just eliminating that, like, look, we don't want any clients in the bottom left, right? If you're not paying us, then we're building grocery store flyers. It's not worth our time. But the reality of the situation is that top right quadrant, the unicorn client, it's hard to sustain an entire business off of that. And so we do acknowledge and settle into the reality that, like, when we have the opportunities to use our talents and our craft to move issues we really care about, sometimes the money's not there, and that's okay. We're going to subsidize it with other opportunities where the money is there. But all of that said, we still have like a standard, right? We don't just accept everything, because otherwise you would undercut what you're doing, right? And work against it. But I think that's how you have to think about it, is you have to make sure that you're doing the work that needs to be done to sustain the engine and keep the machine going. I would never actually want to run a nonprofit and be begging for money, right? I would always want a sustainable business and
that would suck.
the permission structure to be innovative and all of that. Yeah.
If you think you have restrictions in creative execution at a corporate level, the engines are just as bad, if not worse. And because they've got less money, and you're typically doing it for free, more hours, less control, 5,000 reverts, 200 committees. So, capitalism has its advantages sometimes.
I think it's just about a big thing I always try to have guide a lot of my decisions in life is the idea of being deeply moral or aspirational without being delusional, right? And I think a big part of it is just acknowledging that everything has pain points. What pain points can you live with? And I think a big one for me is that I also deeply want to stay and run a for-profit company, but that doesn't need to come at profit for profit's sake. There are places where I have enough and where I know what I personally as a partner need to feel comfortable and okay. That's not becoming the Jeff Bezos of making propaganda at the expense of my morality, at the expense of feeling like I built a culture that I'm going to feel good leaving when I'm done. That to me, I will take significant concessions to how much material wealth I acquire in this lifetime, knowing that after I acquired it, I'll be able to sleep at night and not spend the last 20 years of my life trying to give it away to fix all the problems I made.
But that's the issue with it's cash or power. And I think the kind of area that you're sitting in is that, yes, you might not be making the Super Bowl money, but in terms of the power that you have, in terms of your message and the terms of the impact that you've got, that has got not financial value, but psychic value to you in terms of giving you that adrenaline rush. And I mentioned to Joshua just before we started this call, you've got criminally low numbers on your podcast. It is one of the best ones I've listened to. I listened to the whole lot in one go. But as Joshua mentioned, it's been seen by the right people, and you just going to need to have that inflection point for you to start getting bigger numbers. So the importance of it's not necessarily quantity, it's quality. Let's have a quick talk about brands as an agent of change, because brands are the ones who've got lots of money in this market. And I'm just going to give two examples, and I think you mentioned it in your podcast as well. When brands have tried it, some have messed up real bad. So we take the Pepsi example with that Kylie Jenner. I think it's Kylie. Can't remember. There's so many of them, which was a catastrophe. And then Nike, which was sort of half and half. And then Budweiser. I mean, that was a an own goal in a sense, because perhaps they went at the wrong angle. So maybe let's talk about what role do brands just in America have, for example, to drive social change? Is that their job?
Yeah, and it's funny because that's probably one of the more complicated and nuanced questions we explore within the podcast, because I will say that we have built a lot of what we've done over the years as an agency on the idea of what I would call activist brands, the idea of a for-profit brand trying to move the needle on social or political issues. But one of the things that we've uncovered in our exploration on this topic is that in doing that, no matter what the issue is, whether you agree with the issue or not, when brands participate in these social and political issues, they are driving more of a wedge in society just inherently, right? They are moving things, they are flattening complexity into easy symbols, right? I wear Nikes, therefore I support Black Lives Matter, or I drink Bud Light, or whatever it is. And there is a macro level potential harm that's caused by that. But that's like a systemic level issue. It is not necessarily an issue that an individual brand reckons with. And that's always the hard part of these complex issues, is it's never the individual, it's always just the collective. That said, part of the nuance of this conversation, I think, is around the business model of the brand. So there's a difference between a brand virtue signaling a belief in order to just associate the brand with an identity and then having a brand like Oatly where their whole argument might be, if you drink a glass of oat milk versus a glass of cow's milk, it's better for climate change and the environment, right? Now it's like inherent to the business model, and you can more organically talk about it. And I think that's where I feel much better about brands really leading with social or political messages, is when it all lines up and it's not just them co-opting something in order to elevate their brand.
Another way I would put it is just, at the end of the day, you're deluding yourself if you don't think that any brand's propaganda does not first and foremost function around the brand being profitable and contributing to the bottom line of their business model. A Pepsi commercial exists to sell Pepsi Cola. That's it. It can do other stuff too. It can try and fix racism, but it's selling soda. And I think that's where there's the big differentiation for me. Another way I think about it is, if you're skipping all the way to the top of Maslow's hierarchy, you're saying every Pepsi you drink's fixing racism. Is that true or not? Like, if you're trying to sell self-actualization through values, I would agree with Josh that I'd argue to some degree that is true with Oatly. You know, we know that cows are a massive greenhouse gas emissions contributor. If you buy a glass of Oatly milk, you are fundamentally making some net differential in greenhouse gas emissions. If that's something that's important to you when it comes to self-actualizing, you have achieved that by buying their product and contributing to their bottom line. Whereas Pepsi has not, to my knowledge, solved racism yet, but I'm waiting.
But you bring up the Oatly example. The thing that people, and I think, don't understand sometimes is that there is this binary: cow's milk bad, Oatly good. But you can flip the same thing around and say, well, Oatly is just, the whey basically of oats. It's got sugar, it's got salt, and it's got canola oil, and that's got to be processed a lot, which contributes. It's the same with electric cars. Totally. Yes, fantastic. I live in Norway. Majority of cars are here are electric. It's fantastic. I love it. We walk and cycle everywhere, so the air is clear, is clean, and you can smell the fjord air and so on. But we've exported all of our CO2 to China, basically. Yep. And we're complaining. So there's the positives and negatives in this, and the propaganda side of it is just showing us that little bit. Look how good, look at what good you're doing for you in this minute here.
Yeah.
But forgetting that the masses, the Uyghurs, etc., and all of these folks digging out the nickel and cadmium, etc.,
or the lithium mines in South America. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess it's always important to pause two conversations, right? The first one is that setting aside how I feel about like cow's milk versus oat milk, setting aside how I feel about climate change or these other political issues, there is an illness happening in how messaging is causing the flattening of ideas and aggressively accelerating culture wars and fragmenting people's identities. Moving the needle, I don't want perfection to be the enemy of progress, in the idea of moving the needle on just shifting that back, regardless of what the actual political issue is, regardless of if a Tesla is the best possible solution for the environment. I think that can and maybe should be a separate conversation from the cultural theory of communications, because to me, ultimately, it's still, Bud Light saying it represents American patriotism is still just fundamentally an inaccuracy, right? You are not contributing to American nationalism by buying a certain beer brand or drinking a certain beer brand. That's just false. And I think starting there and starting by retooling some of those conversations will honestly allow us to hold more nuance, because people won't be I'm not going to get, even you mentioning, and this Oatly one comes up a lot. I use this example because I'm a big Oatly stan. It comes up frequently. I feel myself having that like cognitive dissonance, defensiveness triggered. And again, it's because of that very, very deep entanglement. And at least with Oatly, we can now have the conversation, right? If you because you're saying, oh, well, let's talk about canola oils. Let's talk about these things that are in those products. You're right. It does contribute to self-actualization. We can now actually it's not just like, fuck you, I'm an American. What do you mean my beer isn't American? There's nothing there to even start actually parsing. Oh, interesting. What does nationalism mean? Like, you can't even have those deeper conversations below just a tribalist inflammation.
But what propaganda or advertising has done in this case, and you talk about Budweiser, is it creates symbols and recognition of tribes, and you touched on tribes in your podcast as well. So if I drink Budweiser, I'm in this tribe, and that has been built over years and years and years of very expensive advertising at key religious events, NASCAR, the Super Bowl, all of these things. These are the rituals of the American sort of culture for a certain percentage of the population, obviously. And there are key rituals, just like going to church, having the bread and wine and bowing and nodding and crossing yourself, etc. These are things that show that you understand the culture and that you understand the context that you're in. And I guess what you guys are doing with the type of work that you're doing and the type of clients that you're working with is not necessarily trying to get rid of the old, but trying to bring in new cultural artifacts, new cultural associations of what America means. And that's a tough one.
Yeah, I think some of it, getting to the heart of like, okay, if propaganda, the pervasiveness of propaganda has caused cultural harm, can it be solved with more propaganda, right? That in some essence, that's the question. And I think one thing I've been thinking about is more the idea of counter propaganda, which is, can you use your platform in order to just get people's minds to open a little bit and for them to think about things differently? And that's a little different than propaganda, which is normally flattening, right? In that we're trying to break that apart. And there's a lot of precedents for this. I mean, if you want to look at like state propaganda, study how like British operatives were doing counter propaganda in pirate radio stations that they were sending into Nazi Germany, and in that process learning what messages can we put in front of people that it wasn't pro Allied forces. Obviously that wouldn't work. If you're a German citizen and you're hearing, you would shut it out as propaganda. So what message is actually going to work in just getting you to open your mind a little bit and start questioning maybe this Nazi ideology isn't so great. And I think there's a parallel there in what we could be doing in the marketing and advertising world. And I think for us, it starts with our own industry and just the way we talk about these things. Not going through the whole self-congratulatory processes that we tend to whenever we do something like a Dove Real Beauty campaign, where it's like everybody pats themselves on the back saying, oh, we've done something really good here because we've, changed the conversation on beauty standards. But at the same time, you are just like redirecting the issue, right? You are still flattening complex issues down just to sell your soap. And we call out in the podcast, like the same company, Unilever, I know these multinational companies, the brand teams aren't talking to each other, right? And so you have Dove over here doing their thing saying, the way we represent beauty is wrong. And at the same time, you have Axe, who's under the same corporation over here, just like continuing to objectify women.
Being horny.
And that's all just evidence that, yes, this is propaganda. We're doing it to sell soap, right? If it was genuinely an ethos that sat at the core of the company, that wouldn't have been happening. And we know that. We all we're in the boardrooms. We have those conversations. So why do we have this like self-imposed delusion as an industry where we don't call it what it is? We have Simon Sinek giving TED Talks about finding your why. And it's like, I do this for a living. I get paid to go into a room and help people articulate a why. We're not finding it. We're manufacturing it together and using it as a branding tool. And let's call it what it is. That's all.
Well, the hypocrisy of it is quite staggering. I remember when I was growing up that we had two types of shampoo. We had Lux soap and palm olive soap, and there was a men's underarm spray and a woman's underarm spray. And nobody complained that I smell like Lux soap or XYZ. It was just, that's what you washed yourself with. And now with the likes of Unilever, like you've mentioned, and Procter & Gamble, you've got a complete separation of the men's and women's aisles in terms of products. And that is, corporate creating that, and obviously to try and focus on specific target markets and segments. But nobody really needed that. Nobody needed a silver men's shampoo bottle versus a bright, a cream-colored one for the girls, for example. This is all manufactured horseshit that we don't need. And I often look back to my childhood in South Africa, where we were obviously under sanctions and we had, produced most of our own things, but we had 5 chocolate bars. We had Coca-Cola, Sprite, Fanta, and Stony. So those 4 things, and we had milk, and that was it. We had one confectionery brand. We had, life was really simple. It was almost it was capitalist, but it was almost like, Russian in terms of, you had brown boots. You can have brown boots in this color. You can have this shape and size sausage, etc. And it's only when you look outside and say, oh, look at all these nice things everyone else has, do you go, oh, yes, I want 20 different types of chocolates. And I look at some of these American stores where you've got 50 varieties or 50 different brands of cereal. How is that good for society? How much choice do we really need? And if we have less focus on consumerism and products that we buy, maybe then we'd be able to think about other more useful things. I think we've got too much choice, and we need to, if it was me, I'd go to some sort of central planning and say you can have, 3 cereals, and which is basically what Unilever does anyway. It's one cereal plant producing 50 different cereals. So it's not like we're not centrally planned anyway.
I always love thinking about when we start digging into like the intellectual deep end of these really big topics, Western individualism, free markets. I always like trying to think about them as, what are you getting? And then if you flipped it over, what's the MSRP price tag? And to me, the MSRP price tag of combining Western individualism and free markets is that you end up here. You end up where there are 25 deodorants, and how those deodorants are sold to me is that each one is an expression of myself as an individual. My individual existence is comprised of what's in my Target cart, my shopping center cart when I'm leaving. And it's frankly, obviously an inevitability that ends up colliding with political values, right? And like that's where we're at today at its most simple possible form. Is the late 20th century, you saw this explosion of products in the West to just accelerating free markets and individualism talking to each other. I don't think it was a bunch of people in a room, plotting. I think it's just a natural demands being met. But now I think it's time, capitalism is an amazing tool for really rapidly increasing quality of living. You have to hit a conversation point where you go, cool, we did it, folks. Congratulations. We won capitalism. We nailed this. Now let's start having these. We have the space as people to have these more nuanced conversations of what does it mean to live a good, happy, self-actualized, meaningful life. And let's start using the tools we have as democracies to put some guardrails on this and make sure that that's where things are being guided and they aren't just being guided toward profit, because it ends, I think America and a lot of the West are really good examples of, at least we're starting to see, where it's going. It's going to people where vast percentages of our population are mentally ill and unhealthy and medicated and unhappy and unfulfilled and are scared of the future and anxious about the present and kind of just looking back at the past. It's not a good end game. I think a very, very reasonable start is what you're advocating for, which is, going to corporations or just trying to find some really simple stopgap measures we could enforce at a government level that would help with this. The government swooping in and saying you can only have 3 deodorants seems wild, and maybe but I think it would be at least a strange but positive thing, in my opinion.
It'd be like when New York used to sell the taxi medallions, and they're like, there's only so many taxi cabs that can be out there, and it's like, do that for every industry. It's kind of a funny idea.
Go back to guilds.
Yeah.
Hell
yeah. And you touched on something which we can potentially look at, which is you spoke about democracy. And it's such a nebulous term, I think, because the form of democracy, I constantly hear this thing in America, well, it's not really a democracy, it's a republic. And there's a difference between a republic and a democracy. And that is sort of a communication or propaganda that's been promoted within the American system to say democracy is, forget republicanism, where each state, is in charge of their own affairs. We are democracy. And, if we look at we won't go too political, but the kind of democracy that America is trying to spread around the world doesn't work with specific other operating systems, like putting Linux on whatever the other, Ubuntu or whatever. No, that is Linux. Putting Linux onto another it's just not going to work. It's incompatible. We have a lot of freedom in the West, obviously, in terms of media, and the difference we have is that we've got free choice, but we're also being socialized through all of the messaging that we're seeing through all of this various media. Now, the challenge I feel that you've got is that you're not necessarily being able to fight fire with fire, because the big corporates, the sort of entrenched organizations and media organizations have big money behind them. Your messaging is obviously more interesting and possibly more pertinent, which means you can box above your weight class. How are you going to have more impact? Long-winded, sorry.
I mean, it's a great question. I was thinking about it when you mentioned earlier the idea of, sickest podcast I've ever heard, Wanna Webby, why so few listener? And I do think that, like, there's a lot.
That's not democratic. If you want a Webby and 10 people listened, then how democratic is that? More than 10 people listened. I'm not saying that.
Unfortunately, that kind of is. I mean, the I don't know about the problem with democracy. I don't know if I would say that, but a reality of democracy is that anyone can say anything, and the people with the most interesting ideas hopefully get heard the most. That's the idea of that's the premise behind a marketplace of free ideas. The problem with a marketplace of free ideas is that if someone can roll into the marketplace and buy up 99 of the aisles before you get to the 100th aisle, it's not really, I mean, it is a marketplace where any idea can go, but how far are you going to walk into the marketplace before you get tired of walking? And I think that something that's interesting, I always try and balance looking back as a cultural theorist, understanding, contextualizing where we got today, while also trying to look forward and postulate, like, what's tomorrow? And I think we are in a really exciting phase where Josh and I can make a podcast this polished, this commercially presented at this high of a caliber and quality with a fairly small team. I think a big thing for us and the lane we're occupying in terms of intellectual density, and a few of the components of it I think we both are fairly uncompromising around, is that it's going to be about staying consistent. It's going to be about consistently having quality output and trusting that over time it might build more slowly than, being able to go heavily compromise your ideas to ensure that they are broadcast to a significantly wider audience, to a richer person in the marketplace, or, trying to dissect Jungian symbols through a TikTok dance that gets 47 million views overnight. Like, those are options you can choose. I again, it comes back to the same thing for me of everything we're talking about is something where when I zoom out, I say, I could work on this until I'm 75 and I'd still be interested and I'd still be excited. It's something I'm okay with working on for the rest of my life because it's dense enough and it's rich enough and it's complex enough. I think ultimately the big balancing act that Josh and I talk about all the time is how and where do you sacrifice in accessibility? How and where do you... That was a huge thing for me when we started this podcast, was when I start talking about propaganda and I start bringing in these other big academic monoliths and words, I watch people's eyes glaze over. That's a big part of why it's not talked about. It's like trying to go read Foucault or something, and you're like, great, well, now I have to go read 7 other philosophers to even understand what you're talking about. I'm just not going to do this. Too dense. And that was a huge focus of mine, was how can I send this to someone I know who's 28, living in Brooklyn, makes music, and they'll be like, hey, I listened to this whole thing. It was really interesting. It had me thinking. And also, how could we gravitate beyond party lines and stay outside of identity politics and these, like, cultural war wedge issues?
Is that all?
It's a big... It's a big challenge, but I don't know. I like big. I'd rather spend my life just trying to achieve something that is a big, tough problem. That's the thing that's exciting to me, and the thing that, I don't know, makes me get up in the morning and be stoked, and not be like, oh, fuck, I gotta get to the 9 a.m. all hands. Great, to me that's how I stay fired up. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a continuous challenge and question. The big question you're asking of like, how are you guys going to get a bigger viewership is something that, I'd say that's currently the question we're spending the most time trying to answer and figure out.
Yeah.
I can tell you.
Only thing I'd add to this conversation too is, the question of impact, making sure you're measuring the right things and looking at the right numbers. And sometimes a number doesn't tell you, right? And this is something that I think is important with our clients as well, and sits at the ethos of us as a creative agency, which is you're going to get bombarded. What is the classic thing? 1,000 messages a day, and you remember 2 or 3 of them. This idea that make number go up and that's success, when we know how disposable every impression is, versus making the thing where a fraction of the people consume it, but those that do, it sits with them and it changes their behaviors or changes how they see the world. That's so much more meaningful to me, and I think that's ultimately should be meaningful to everybody that's making propaganda, whatever their goal is.
1,000,000%.
Yeah, political. I mean, that is, in the political realm, that was, when you look at like the 2016 election in America and the Trump versus Hillary thing, and how it was so shocking to the American establishment that Trump won. But it's like, you look at, he spent a fraction of the dollars that she did on media. He just made much more connection. There was much more enthusiasm for him. People wanted to show up, and that spread like wildfire in a way that she didn't have. And I think these like kind of modernist ways of looking at at how our media works and how culture works is wrong. And we need to adjust the paradigm of how we see it and understand what is the thing that genuinely moves culture. Because I don't think it's the TikTok dance.
Yeah.
Even if that gets the millions of views. Even
a similar thought experiment is like, who moved culture more, Edward Bernays or Marilyn Monroe? Not everyone, very few people know about Edward Bernays, but he was in the right rooms with the right people. I'd rather have 100 of the Fortune 500 CEOs subscribed than 100,000 people that are going to listen and probably just forget.
Well, something that stuck out from one of your podcasts was the Freedom Torch. I love those, and listeners, you're going to have to go and listen to that episode about the Freedom Torches. Talking about the political system, I think where Trump got it right and Hillary got it wrong is that Hillary tried to be all things to all people and be a Unilever and try and create little pockets and say, I've got this for you. I like the blacks. I like the Mexicans. I like the Latinos. I like the this. I like the gays. And whereas Trump knew 50% of the country is going to hate him regardless of what he does, or 49.5%. All he need, and he spoke to his base just consistently. He knew who his target market was, and he just needed to shift 1%, 50 plus 1. That's it. And I think that's what some of these brands are very smart about. That's the Unilevers and that. They know that, and this is, I think, where progressive brands have a ceiling but also an opportunity, is that you're going to have 50% of the people are going to hate your product no matter what you do. And you have to focus on your base and just convert that 1% and then another percent. It's not about trying to get, swallow the whole elephant. You've got to start by the tail. And I think that's what where a lot of people make mistakes, jumping from trying to eat the whole whale. Impossible. You'll never ever make anybody happy. And if I can just make one last point to that and maybe give me your viewpoint on this. What I see happening in America right now, or in Western culture as a whole, is very similar to what happened in the time of Constantine in Rome, where they moved over to Christianity. It was moving away from the old gods. It was moving away from, worshipping the emperors and having, 5,000 goddesses and gods and seasonal gods, etc., to a monotheist culture. We're going the other way now. We're going back to the 1,000 goddesses, 1,000 gods, etc. Your thoughts on that?
That's a very fun parallel. As someone who loves history and loves Roman history, that is a very fun parallel to try and examine what is currently occurring in culture with a reversion, an inversion of a shift from polytheism into monotheistic views. I suppose, agree. I think so much of when you start bringing in religion and theology into the conversation is foundationally based in the idea that that was how you self-actualize. I mean, we're talking about a version of the lived human experience that was violent, brutal, short, and primarily dominated by a world you did not understand at all. You had no understanding of what the hell was going on. And religion functioned as a deeply necessary symbol for survival within that, where the human mind could wrap itself around and rectify these profound and terrifying unknowns of a short and violent life. We're now confronted with a life that is profoundly long, where I can know everything. And I'm confronted with the reality of needing to decide in my 75 plus years on Earth, what am I going to know? Because the compendium of human knowledge is at my fingertips. And I think that's probably a big part of why you're seeing what you're describing of a return to more of a polytheistic view, but through culture, is because of that reaction to just survival, right? Of like, I need to find my symbols that are going to give me a reason to live. I also have an exposure to, you know, every single person alive has their Library of Alexandria. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could talk politics, religion, brands, propaganda all day. I'm going to call it here because I think we could probably have another session and talk perhaps on one particular topic. But it's been fascinating getting to know you guys and hear some of your ideas. And I would recommend that folks check out your website. Where can I send folks to get a bit more information about you, Joshua?
Yeah, so we're just at brink.com, brink.com, and that's where you can learn all about us. And the podcast, this is propaganda.show.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys, and I look forward to chatting to you again. And I'm hoping you have your next season coming out, and I'll definitely binge on that as well.
Thank you. We really appreciate your support. It was a great conversation.